Hello, friends. This is Darren Hayes of PigskinDispatch.com. Before we take you to your favorite Sports History Network show, just want to tell you a little bit about some merch that you can pick up that represents your favorite SHN podcast. So far, there's t-shirts, coffee mugs, and even books from some of the authors that do podcasts right here on SHN. Who could buy something better than that than have the history right from the gentleman that you hear talking about it? But we also are adding things each and every day. And where's that store, may you ask? Well, it's at SportsHistoryNetwork.com. Up at the top, there is the SHN merch button. Click on that. It'll take you right to the store, and you can be representing your favorite podcast and show the world that, hey, on the swag that I'm using, it's the headquarters of sports yesteryear, Sports History Network, and my favorite podcaster, the Sports History Network store. Shop there today.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
Hello, sports fans, and welcome to another edition of Yesterday's Sports on the Sports History Network. With the Super Bowl having just been played, I wanted to take a look back at a team that many fans assumed was going to win the Super Bowl, but didn't. Some may have forgotten just how good the 1983 Washington Redskins were. But they were one of the most dominant teams of the 1980s, up until that fateful day on January 2nd, 1984. Going into the 1983 season, the Redskins were the defending Super Bowl champions, having lost only one game in a strike-shortened 1982 season. The 1983 season kicked off with a Monday night showdown against their hated rivals, the Dallas Cowboys. Dallas was hungry for revenge, as Washington had denied them a chance to play in their sixth Super Bowl, defeating the boys 31-17 in the 1982 NFC Championship game. It was a hot and humid Labor Day evening at RFK Stadium, and the Skins were out to prove that their 1982 season was no one-year wonder. Washington stormed out to a 23-3 halftime lead. But the second half was all Dallas. Tony Dorsett ran for 151 yards, and receiver Tony Hill gained 133 yards receiving, and the Skins lost 31-30. The one bright spot in the loss was that quarterback Joe Theismann played brilliantly, completing 28 of 38 passes for 325 yards and 2 touchdowns. 10 of those completions were caught by receiver Alvin Garrett, who gained 101 yards. The Skins traveled to Philadelphia in Week 2 and beat the Eagles 23-13 as John Riggins ran for 100 yards. The team got off to a slow start in a Week 3 game against the Chiefs at RFK, trailing at halftime 12-0. But they scored 27 unanswered points in the second half to win 27-12. Washington gained 180 yards on the ground while holding Kansas City to just 33. Washington traveled to Seattle for a Week 4 victory against the Seahawks. The Redskins kept the ball on the ground for most of the game, as Theismann threw only 16 times, but with a passer rating of 130.7. Week 5 saw an offensive shootout as Washington defeated the Raiders 37-35 at RFK Stadium. Joe Theismann had another big day, completing 23 of 39 passes for an astounding 417 yards and 3 touchdowns. Receiver Charlie Brown caught 11 of those passes for 180 yards and a touchdown. The team traveled to St. Louis for an easy 38-14 Week 6 win over the Cardinals, and John Riggins rushed for 115 yards. After 5 straight wins, the Redskins suffered a 48-47 loss to the Green Bay Packers on Monday Night Football at Lambeau Field. The two teams combined for over 800 yards in passing. To this day, it is the second highest scoring game on Monday Night Football. Receiver Art Monk had a big game with 5 catches for 105 yards, and Joe Theismann continued his outstanding play, going 27 for 39 with 398 yards and 2 touchdowns. The Skins returned home with an easy Week 8 win, beating the Lions 38-17. Washington outgained Detroit 441 yards to 147, as running back Joe Washington ran for 147 yards on 22 carries. Joe Theismann had another great game with a 130.2 passer rating. In Week 9, the San Diego Chargers gave Washington all they could handle at Jack Murphy Stadium, but the Skins came out on top, 27-24. Charlie Brown caught 8 passes for 101 yards. A Week 10 matchup against the Cardinals at RFK was no contest, as the Skins gained over 200 yards on the ground and ran away with a 45-7 victory. Washington had another relatively easy win in Week 11, a game against the Giants at the Meadowlands, outgaining the Giants on the ground 140 yards to 25, and coasting to a 33-17 win. Washington continued their winning ways against the Rams in Week 12 at Anaheim. The Skins outgained the Rams 467 yards to 191, while holding running back Eric Dickerson to just 37 yards. Charlie Brown had another big game, gaining 140 yards on 8 catches. The Eagles gained over 300 yards passing, but it wasn't enough as Washington upped their record to 11-2 in a Week 13 win. Charlie Brown continued his outstanding play, gaining 147 yards on 7 catches, while Joe Theismann had another game with an over 100 passer rating. The final was 28-24. The Redskins won again in Week 14, game at RFK, beating the Falcons 37-21. Theismann finished the game with a 121.3 passer rating. The Redskins avenged their Week 1 loss to the Cowboys with a 31-10 thumping at Texas Stadium in Week 15. Art Monk had 6 catches for 119 yards, while Theismann once again had a 120 passer rating. The Skins' defense held Tony Dorsett to just 34 yards rushing. Having already clinched home field advantage throughout the playoffs, Washington trailed the Giants in the fourth quarter 22-17. It might have been Joe Theismann's only poor performance of the year, as he threw 4 interceptions. Meanwhile, the Redskins' defense allowed over 300 yards passing for the 8th time this season. Some of that can be attributed to teams' inability to run against them, but it was a bit of a concern going into the playoffs. Nonetheless, Washington pulled out the victory 31-22 as John Riggins ran for 122 yards. Washington finished the regular season with 14 wins and only 2 losses. Joe Theismann won the NFL MVP award, and Joe Gibbs won the Coach of the Year award. Charlie Brown gained 1,225 yards receiving, while John Riggins gained 1,347 yards rushing. Theismann and Riggins were named first-team All-Pro, as were offensive linemen Joe Jacoby and Russ Grimm. On defense, free safety Mark Morthier and defensive tackle Dave Butts were also named first-team All-Pro. The team scored a record 541 points, and that record stood until 1998. The team also had a plus 43 turnover differential, a record that still stands. Next week, we will have part 2 as the Washington Redskins go into the playoffs. Hope you enjoyed this podcast, and we'll see you again next week. Thank you, and God bless.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com. Hey there, sports history fan. This is Arnie Chapman, a.k.a. the Football History Dude, and I hope that you enjoyed this recent episode presented by the Sports History Network and were able to learn some good old-fashioned sports history knowledge nuggets. I started the Sports History Network back in 2020 with the mission to help podcasters find a community of like-minded sports history nerds, as well as helping aspiring podcasters to start their own shows. We have a little bit over 30 shows on the network right now covering all sorts of sports history, but as far as I'm concerned, we're just at the toothpick in the ocean moment, that can't even figure it out because there's so much more coming. We wanted to create the ultimate headquarters for sports yesteryear, starting with Podcast Network and our website, but we're going to continue to move into other mediums as well. And here's the cool part, because we want you to be part of our team. So if you're interested in starting your own podcast, or maybe being a guest on one of our shows, or who knows, maybe even writing an article for us over on the website. Seriously, all you gotta do is reach out to us on the contact page over at sportshistorynetwork.com. You can be as technologically savvy as a Neanderthal tapping on a stone trying to figure out this whole hieroglyphics thing back in the day. Again, it doesn't matter, because even if you don't understand the whole podcast space, we have a production team that can pretty much help you out with doing everything. All you gotta do, head over to sportshistorynetwork.com, head to the contact page, fill it out. That message goes right to me, and I'll reach out to you as soon as I can. But for now, dude, I'm through if you're through.